Growing up in my family always felt like standing in someone else's spotlight, one I wasn't meant to touch. My parents had favorites. My older sibling was praised for every tiny achievement, showered with attention, gifts, and constant validation, while I lingered in the background, a shadow in our own home. I remember walking into the living room with a new drawing I had worked on for days, only to have my mom glance at it, roll her eyes and mumble, "That's nice, I guess," before returning to a conversation about my siblings' latest piano recital. It wasn't just that they ignored me. It was the way they dismissed my existence with effortless ease. Even in public, I felt the sting of embarrassment. At family gatherings, I'd try to share something exciting, only to be talked over or laughed at softly, as if my excitement were a joke. Yet through every snide remark and every overlooked accomplishment, I learned patience. I observed carefully, stored my hurt quietly, and cultivated an inner strength they could never see. By the time I reached adolescence, I understood the rules of survival in a household where love was rationed and approval was conditional. I kept my ambitions private, my thoughts measured, and my emotions guarded, learning to navigate the microaggressions and subtle humiliations with a quiet, almost invisible resilience. Even when my parents dismissed me outright, I refused to crumble. Instead, I nurtured an inner certainty that one day they would have to acknowledge me, not by their choice, but by my own actions. Every rolled eye, every sarcastic comment, every overlooked milestone became fuel for a silent fire, a determination to prove my worth without begging for their recognition. I carried myself with calm, even in the moments I wanted to cry, because I understood early that vulnerability in that house was a liability. My quiet strength wasn't loud or showy, but it was steady, patient, and unyielding, a slow-building force that would eventually demand attention, whether they were ready for it or not. I spent years giving more than I received, quietly shouldering responsibilities my parents barely acknowledged. I stayed up late helping my younger sibling with homework I didn't understand, missing my own assignments, only to hear my mom sigh and say, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" I cooked dinner after long days at school and part-time jobs, hoping for a simple thank you. But instead, my dad would glance at the table, shrug, and mutter, "It's fine, just eat." Even when I saved up my own money to cover my sister's birthday present because they claimed there wasn't enough in the budget, my efforts were brushed off, met with a curt nod, while she received a new tablet and a cake bigger than my own. Small incidents piled up, like the time I picked up my mom from the airport after a grueling 12-hour shift at work, exhausted and sweaty, and she barely looked at me, turning to hug my brother first. Or the night my dad laughed when I suggested a family movie night. "Why bother? Your sister's already planned everything." Each act of favoritism stung, not because I wanted attention, but because it was clear my contributions were invisible. I began to tally every sacrifice, every unnoticed effort, every quiet kindness that went unrecognized, and beneath my patience, a simmering resentment took root. I told myself I wasn't bitter, that I was simply learning how to survive in a house where love was selectively distributed. But inside, the desire for justice was growing, a quiet whisper that one day the scales would tip, and they would finally see the consequences of dismissing me for so long. I practiced restraint, stored my anger, and let the unfairness fuel a determination to rise above, knowing that someday, the world outside this house would have to acknowledge my worth. The day everything changed started quietly, almost innocently, with a letter slipping through the mail slot, its envelope thick and official. I tore it open to find the details of my late uncle's estate, an inheritance I had been promised in passing years ago, only to discover that my parents had maneuvered behind my back to redirect the bulk of it to my sibling. I felt my stomach drop, the blood rushing to my face as I reread the lines. All the careful planning, all the quiet sacrifices I'd made, completely disregarded. It wasn't just money. It was recognition, a validation I had been denied my entire life. The rage simmered, hotter with every memory. Staying up nights to tutor my sibling, missing birthdays to cover family expenses, working overtime while being mocked for asking for small allowances. And here they were, smug and self-assured, acting like I had no right to what was mine. I remember looking at my mother's smug face the next morning, her eyes rolling as if to say, "You'll never amount to anything anyway," and my father's dismissive chuckle as if to punctuate the humiliation. I felt the weight of all those years, the ignored achievements, the public snubs, the subtle cruelty, pressing down until I could barely breathe. That's when I realized I wouldn't stand for it anymore. If the law could recognize what my parents refused to acknowledge, then I would wield it like a weapon. They didn't see me coming, and that made the thought of stepping into a courtroom intoxicating, thrilling even. Every sneer, every joke at my expense, every "you don't deserve this," fueled a determination I hadn't allowed myself before. This wasn't about greed. It was about justice, recognition, and finally turning the tables on a family that had underestimated me my entire life. For the first time, I felt the sharp edge of empowerment. The exhilaration of knowing that I had the means to demand respect, and that the people who had made me feel small would have no choice but to see me in my full power. Sitting in my tiny apartment, papers spread across the coffee table, I let my mind wander back to all the times I had been dismissed, ignored, or humiliated. I remembered my father laughing when I asked for help with college applications. "You'll figure it out, like always," as if my struggles were a joke. My mother had once scolded me for asking for a raise at my first job, muttering, "Stop being so greedy," while praising my sibling for negotiating a promotion I had helped them prepare for. These memories fueled my resolve as I highlighted key documents, cross-referenced receipts, and drafted timelines of every instance of favoritism, neglect, and dishonesty. My lawyer, an astute woman with piercing eyes, leaned over the table and said, "They think they've got this in the bag. Don't underestimate how arrogant they are. But we have the evidence. They won't know what hit them." I nodded, a quiet thrill coursing through me. My confidant, a close friend who had witnessed my sacrifices, added, "You've been patient your whole life, but now it's your turn. They're about to realize they miscalculated." I couldn't help but smile at the thought. For years, I had been underestimated, passed over, and silenced. But now, I had meticulously prepared a strategy that left no room for their usual smirks or eye rolls. Every flashback, every slight, every whispered, "You'll never amount to anything," was now catalogued, a tool in my arsenal. I rehearsed statements, anticipated their objections, and visualized the courtroom, seeing myself calm, composed, and unwavering while their confidence faltered. It was intoxicating to think that the arrogance they had wielded against me for decades would become the very thing that blinded them in the end. I knew their overconfidence would be their downfall, and the thought of it made me steady my hands, take a deep breath, and prepare to step into a room where finally I would be seen, not as the overlooked child, but as someone who demanded and deserved justice. The courthouse doors felt heavier than they should have, as if the weight of years of neglect had somehow settled into the wood. I stepped inside, suit pressed, papers organized, heart steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. My parents were already there, seated with an air of superiority that I had come to recognize all too well. My mother's eyes narrowed, followed by the slow, exaggerated roll of her eyes, while my father leaned back with a faint, dismissive smirk. I caught the faintest whisper of, "Here we go again," drifting from them, and it would have been enough to unsettle anyone else, but not me. I walked past them with measured steps, head high, taking in every detail of the courtroom, the polished wooden benches, the judge's elevated seat, the murmurs of the spectators. Inside, I ran through my mental checklist, reminding myself of every fact, every piece of evidence, every word I had rehearsed. The contrast between their casual arrogance and my careful preparation made the tension almost unbearable, but I let it sharpen me rather than intimidate me. Each dismissive glance they threw my way became fuel, a reminder of every slight, every eye roll, every time they had underestimated me. I felt the familiar surge of determination, quiet but unrelenting, as I slid into my seat and waited for the proceedings to begin. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath alongside me, the anticipation thick, a tangible bridge between past humiliation and the justice I was about to demand. The judge called the courtroom to order, and I felt a pulse of adrenaline mixed with calm focus. My parents straightened, smug smiles still plastered on their faces, as if the room itself were already theirs. The clerk began reading the initial filings, and I watched their expressions flicker. Subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that made my chest tighten with quiet satisfaction. I had anticipated their overconfidence, and it was showing cracks already. As the first witness took the stand, a financial advisor who had meticulously documented the estate transfers, I felt a thrill of vindication. "Your parents redirected funds without consulting you?" the lawyer asked, voice steady. My parents exchanged a brief, tense glance, my mother's lip twitching, my father clearing his throat nervously. I couldn't help but think, finally, the truth is visible to everyone, and it stings more than any insult I endured at home. Each question revealed layers of favoritism and deliberate neglect, and with every answer, my meticulous preparation shone. I kept my hands folded, calm and composed, letting the evidence speak while internally savoring the subtle shift in power. The courtroom seemed to pulse with the tension between my parents' pride and the undeniable proof of their dismissive and manipulative behavior. My heart raced in controlled beats. I allowed a faint, satisfied smile as they realized, even slightly, that I wasn't the child they thought I was. Their arrogance, built over decades, was starting to crumble, and I felt a quiet, potent joy at knowing that the first blow had landed. Just when I thought the courtroom had settled into a predictable rhythm, my lawyer called a surprise witness, a former family accountant I had contacted months ago, quietly gathering information no one expected me to have. I watched my parents' faces tighten instantly, their confident smirks faltering as the witness began detailing financial transactions, favors redirected, and subtle manipulations they had assumed no one could trace. My mother's eyes widened, and my father's hand twitched nervously on the armrest. I felt a rush of vindication, a quiet thrill that their arrogance was beginning to crack under the weight of proof. They didn't see me coming, I thought, savoring the irony. Every carefully documented email, bank statement, and notarized note I had painstakingly collected now bore fruit. The witness's calm, precise recounting painted a picture of favoritism, deceit, and neglect that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom air seemed to thrum with tension, the invisible status scales tipping in my favor. My parents shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other, their overconfidence giving way to panic. I held my composure, letting the evidence do the work, letting the subtle power reversal unfold. For the first time, I could see them realizing that their lifetime of underestimating me had consequences. The audience, the court, and even the judge leaned in, and I felt a quiet exhilaration. My patient, silent strategy had reached this apex, and the first true shift in control had been achieved. The smug superiority they had wielded for years was cracking, and in its place, a stunned realization that the child they had dismissed for decades was suddenly unshakable, unyielding, and in command. As the proceedings continued, the courtroom felt electric, charged with unspoken anticipation. My father leaned forward, voice sharp, attempting to interrupt the witness. "That's ridiculous. Those numbers don't mean anything." My mother scoffed under her breath. "You're making a mountain out of nothing." I felt a flicker of the old frustration rise, but I steadied myself, taking a deep breath and letting the silence stretch just long enough before I spoke. Calmly, measured, with all due respect, the documentation speaks for itself. Each transaction is verified and dated, showing a clear pattern. I caught the judge's approving nod, and a quiet thrill coursed through me. My internal monologue reminded me of every time they had tried to dismiss me, every sarcastic comment, every eye roll. They had no idea this was coming. The tension between my composed authority and their flustered arrogance intensified with each exchange. "You think you can intimidate the court with theatrics?" my father barked. I simply smiled faintly, replying, "I'm not here to intimidate. I'm here to present the facts." My mother's lip curled in disbelief, and I felt the surge of power reversal grow. Each time they tried to belittle me, I countered with precision, letting logic and evidence overshadow their emotional outbursts. Inside, my heart raced, alternating between satisfaction and a sharp edge of anxiety. This was the culmination of years of preparation and silent endurance. Every rebuttal, every pointed correction, every unwavering glance at the judge reinforced my authority and steadily dismantled their overconfidence. The courtroom was alive with tension, the highs and lows of each verbal exchange echoing the years of dismissal and neglect I had endured. And with each moment, I felt closer to the justice I had been denied for so long. just when it seemed my parents might recover their composure. My lawyer stood and held up a thick envelope, the weight of it feeling almost symbolic in my hands. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady, "we have additional evidence that was only recently discovered." My parents' eyes flicked toward each other, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing their usually impervious faces. The documents detailed a series of deliberate manipulations, transfers hidden in plain sight, gifts redirected, and contracts signed without my consent. All actions designed to sideline me in favor of my sibling. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide, and my father's jaw clenched as he tried to mask the shock. I felt an electric surge of vindication, every humiliation I had endured crystallizing into this moment. Finally, they see what they've done. Finally, they realize they underestimated me. I sat calmly, letting the courtroom absorb the weight of the revelation while internally savoring the moment. The judge reviewed the evidence, nodding thoughtfully, and the murmurs of the spectators rippled through the room. I allowed myself a subtle smile. My parents had never imagined that the quiet, overlooked child could marshal such precise, undeniable proof. Their confidence was shattered, replaced by a raw, stunned realization that their arrogance had blinded them to my capabilities. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow, dismantling the narrative they had so carefully constructed over the years. I reflected on every early dismissal, every eye roll, every sarcastic remark. They had all led to this apex, this moment of undeniable truth. The tension in the room shifted, and the emotional momentum swung fully in my favor. For the first time, the courtroom was silent but charged, the audience sensing the catharsis building, knowing that justice, long delayed, was finally unfolding. The years of neglect, mockery, and favoritism had collided with meticulous preparation, and the parents, once confident and dismissive, were left powerless, blindsided by a child they had thought invisible. In that charged silence, I felt the sweet, quiet triumph of being seen, of finally having the truth recognized and respected. The room held its breath as the judge adjusted his glasses, sifting through the piles of evidence I had meticulously prepared. I sat upright, heart steady but pulse quickened, every nerve alert to the subtle shifts in my parents' expressions. My mother's face had gone pale, lips pressed tight, while my father's confident posture slumped imperceptibly, like a fortress quietly crumbling. After reviewing the documentation, witness statements, and supporting evidence, the judge began, voice measured and authoritative. It is clear that the plaintiff has been systematically disadvantaged and misrepresented in this family estate. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Relief and exhilaration surged through me simultaneously, a potent mix of justice finally realized, and years of suppressed anger being acknowledged. I allowed myself a slow exhale, the kind I hadn't permitted in decades of neglect. My parents froze, their eyes widening, mouths opening slightly as if the words themselves had physically struck them. Whispers rippled across the courtroom. The audience sensed the magnitude of the reversal, the humbling of a family that had long wielded power and favoritism with impunity. Internally, I reflected on every slight, every rolled eye, every sarcastic comment that had fueled this exact moment. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moral and emotional vindication, a public acknowledgement that I mattered and had been underestimated far too long. I felt a strange, liberating calm settle over me, a quiet triumph that was mine alone, tempered with compassion. Because this wasn't about vengeance for vengeance's sake, but about being recognized and respected. The judge's gavel struck, final and resounding, echoing like a heartbeat through the silent courtroom. My parents sat motionless, stunned, humiliated in a way that mirrored every moment they had tried to belittle me. And as I gathered my papers ready to leave the courtroom, I realized that the years of patience, quiet perseverance, and careful planning had coalesced into this instant. An unassailable affirmation that I was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, and no longer powerless. The sense of relief, the surge of vindication, and the profound satisfaction of justice being served washed over me in a wave so intense it felt almost surreal, but undeniably, finally, real. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, the kind that comes from carrying a heavy weight for years and finally laying it down. I thought about every slight, every sarcastic remark, every time my parents had made me feel invisible or unworthy, the sting of neglect, the humiliation at family gatherings, The constant comparisons to my sibling, they all surged briefly, then faded as I realized how far I had come. I no longer needed their approval or validation. The quiet power I had cultivated through patience, diligence, and strategic action was enough. Watching them sit in stunned silence during the verdict replayed in my mind, I felt a calm satisfaction that went deeper than any outward celebration. Their eyes, once dismissive, now reflected shock and disbelief, a subtle acknowledgement that the hierarchy they had enforced for decades had been dismantled. I walked through the courthouse doors feeling lighter, morally clear, and internally triumphant, knowing I had acted with integrity, not spite. The reversal of status wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the shift of perception, in the recognition that my value had never depended on their approval. For the first time, I felt fully seen, not by their measure, but by my own standards and the undeniable truth of my actions. Each step away from that room was a reclamation of dignity, a quiet assertion that I could rise above cruelty and still emerge with strength and moral clarity intact. The years of patience, resilience, and unseen effort had culminated in this silent triumph, leaving me empowered, vindicated, and finally at peace with the past. As I sit quietly now, away from the courtroom and the stunned faces of my parents, I let myself reflect on everything that brought me here. I've realized that resilience isn't just enduring pain. It's learning to navigate it with purpose, to transform every slight, every roll of the eyes, every whispered insult into fuel for your own growth. Setting boundaries, protecting your worth, and refusing to let others define you became my quiet rebellion, the way I reclaimed power that had been denied for so long. I think back to all the times I stayed silent, the sacrifices I made, and the patience I cultivated. They were not wasted. Each moment of neglect and betrayal was a lesson in strategy, self-respect, and emotional intelligence. I understand now that self-worth cannot be granted by others. It must be claimed, nurtured, and defended. Looking at the past, I feel catharsis for the pain I endured and empowerment in the knowledge that I can rise above even the most dismissive and manipulative people. My parents' reactions, their shock and their humbling, are no longer sources of anger, but reminders that underestimation can be overturned and that justice, when carefully pursued, can restore dignity. I hope anyone listening understands this. The battles we face within toxic relationships do not define us. How we respond does. Strength lies not in retaliation alone, but in persistence, integrity, and the quiet assertion of our value. I walk forward carrying all I've learned, stronger, wiser, and fully aware that I am deserving of respect, recognition, and peace. No one else's approval required.